Welcome to the deep dive. We have a lot to get through today. I mean, we are looking at a massive stack of sources, epidemiological data, virology research, historical timelines, and even some public health ethical frameworks.
This is a very comprehensive set of materials, yeah.
Right. And our mission today is to, well, fundamentally change how you, the listener, view a disease you probably thought you already completely understood.
Because most people really do think they understand.
Exactly. We're talking about the measles virus. And the goal is to move entirely past this, outdated, nostalgic cultural idea of measles as just some harmless childhood rash. We need to understand it for what the data shows it actually is. It's one of humanity's most contagious pathogens, a biological memory eraser, and honestly, the ultimate test of human social trust.
It really is a masterclass in contagion.
So I want to start by asking you to set the scene for us. Like, just how contagious are we talking?
Okay, so picture a standard, everyday doctor's waiting room. Someone is sitting in one of those, vinyl chairs. They have a fever, a bit of a cough, and their eyes are a little red and watery.
So they just look like they have a cold.
Exactly. Maybe they just think it's a bad cold. After a few minutes, a nurse calls their name, they stand up, and they leave the room. So the room is now completely empty.
Okay.
But here is the terrifying biological reality of the virus we're looking at today. Up to 2 full hours later.
Wait, 2 hours?
2 full hours later, a completely different, susceptible person can walk into that exact same empty room, sit in a different chair, simply breathe the indoor air, and catch the virus.
Just from breathing the air in an empty room?
Yes, the person who left it there is long gone. But among susceptible close contacts, up to 9 out of 10 people who enter that airspace will become infected.
9 out of 10.
Yeah. It functions almost like a biological ghost.
That is just, I want you, the listener, to just sit with that visual for a second. Imagine a virus that doesn't just attack your physical body, but actively uses the very air you share to just, wait for the tiny gaps in our collective armor.
And to understand how a virus can linger in an empty room like that, we really have to start at the foundation, right? We need to look at its biological blueprint and how it physically breaches the human body.
Let's do it. What are we dealing with?
Scientifically, the virus is known as morbillivirus hominis.
Okay.
It's an enveloped, single-stranded, negative-sense RNA virus. And it belongs to the Paramyxoviridae family.
Okay, stop right there, because I am already swimming in jargon. Let's break this down. First of all, just on a naming level, I need to clear up something that I've always been confused by.
Sure.
When we say measles, we are talking about rubeola, right? Not rubella. I feel like I always hear those two thrown around together. Are they related at all?
Oh, they sound like siblings, but biologically, they're not related at all. It's a very, very common point of confusion. Rubeola is the clinical name for classic measles. That's the one we're focusing on today.
Right.
Rubella is a completely different virus from an entirely different family. People often call it German measles.
Right.
It actually causes a milder illness, though it is incredibly dangerous to pregnant women.
Got it. But our focus today is rubeola, the classic measles.
Exactly.
Okay, so going back to that string of scientific terms you just dropped, enveloped, single-stranded, negative-sense RNA. Let's translate that for everyone. What does that actually mean for the virus as a physical object?
Let's visualize it. So when we say it's an enveloped virus, it basically means it wears a fatty membrane on its outside.
It's a coat.
Right, like a coat. And it actually steals this lipid bilayer from the host cell when it exits.
Oh, wow. So it's wearing a stolen coat.
Stolen coat to camouflage itself, yeah. And inside that coat is the single-stranded RNA, which is its genetic code. But the negative sense part is what's really fascinating.
I was going to ask about that. What makes RNA negative sense? Like, is the virus just pessimistic?
Not exactly. It refers to the direction the genetic code is read.
Okay.
So human cells read genetic code in what we call a positive sense to build proteins. Because the measles virus has negative sense RNA, it's essentially written backward.
Backward. So our cells can't even read it.
Exactly. When it enters a human cell, the host cell's machinery just can't read it. So the virus actually has to bring its own special enzyme and RNA polymerase packed inside its envelope.
Wait, it brings its own translation tool.
Yes. First thing it does upon entering the cell is use that enzyme to transcribe its backward RNA into positive sense RNA. Then the human cell can finally read it and start manufacturing more virus parts.
That is incredibly sneaky. It literally brings its own translator to hijack the factory.
It does, but before it can translate anything, it has to break into the cell in the first place.
Right.
And on the surface of that stolen fatty envelope, it has 2 crucial glycoproteins that act like tools for a break-in.
What are they?
You have the H protein, which stands for hemagglutinin, and the F protein, the fusion protein.
So how do they work together? Is it like, I don't know, a grappling hook and a battering ram?
That is actually an excellent analogy. The H protein is the grappling hook. It reaches out and physically grabs onto specific receptors on the outside of a human host cell.
Okay, so it latches on.
Right. And once the H protein is locked on, the F protein, the battering ram, activates. It forces the viral envelope to literally melt into or fuse with the host cell's membrane.
Wow.
Yeah, that fusion creates a hole, allowing the virus to just dump its genetic payload inside.
So it latches on, kicks the door down, and drops in its backward blueprint.
Precisely.
But the timeline of this invasion is what makes it so stealthy, I think. Because going back to that waiting room scenario, if I walk in and breathe that air, I don't wake up the next day with spots, right? I probably feel fine for a while.
You will feel completely fine for about a week to 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah, the incubation period averages 10 to 14 days. During that time, the virus is quietly orchestrating a massive systemic takeover of your body.
Under the radar.
Completely. And this brings us to the most crucial epidemiological detail of this disease. A patient is contagious for 4 full days before the classic rash ever appears,
And after.
and for 4 days after.
Wait, so for almost half a week, you are walking around, going to the grocery store, going to work or school, talking to people, and shedding massive amounts of infectious virus into the air, and you don't even know you're sick.
Yes, you might have like a slight fever or a bit of a cough, but you just think it's a routine cold. You have absolutely no idea you're a walking biological distributor.
That makes the mechanics of how it moves through the body really important to understand, because it obviously isn't just hanging out in the back of the throat if it takes 2 weeks to show up on the skin. Where does it go during that hidden window?
Its cellular pathway is diabolical, honestly.
How so?
Remember the grappling hook? The H protein?
Yeah.
Early in the infection, that H protein is looking for a very specific target called a CD150 receptor. Now, the location of that receptor is what makes measles so uniquely devastating.
Where is it?
CD150 is found primarily on immune cells, specifically alveolar macrophages and dendritic cells in your airway.
Wait, so the very cells whose entire job is to patrol the lungs, identify invaders, and destroy them, the virus actively targets those specific cells.
Yes, it infects the immune system's own patrol units.
That's insane.
And then, instead of killing them immediately, it hitchhikes on them.
Like it rides them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As these infected immune cells travel back to the lymph nodes to sound the alarm about an invasion, they're actually carrying the Trojan horse directly into the body's defensive headquarters.
That is just brilliant in the most horrifying way possible. It uses the immune system's own internal highways to spread systemically.
Right, and that causes a massive amplification of the virus in the lymphatic tissues. From there, it just spills into the bloodstream.
Okay, so now it's everywhere.
Yes. And then, later in the infection, the virus switches tactics.
It changes targets.
It does. It stops looking for the CD150 receptor and starts looking for a second receptor called Nectin-4.
And where is Nectin-4?
Nectin-4 is found on epithelial cells. So these are the cells lining your respiratory tract, your windpipe, your lungs.
Ah, I see. So it uses the immune cells to get into the body and multiply in the lymph nodes, and then uses the respiratory cells to exit the body.
Exactly.
It basically turns your lungs into a virus factory so you cough it out onto other people.
That's the mechanism.
Yeah.
It sheds massive amounts of virus into your breath and coughs.
Okay, I want to offer an analogy for anyone listening who, like me, always pictured measles as a skin condition. Because when we think of measles, the very first image in our head is that angry, red, speckled rash.
Sure, that's the classic image.
But looking at this timeline, the rash isn't the fire. The rash is the smoke alarm.
Oh, I like that.
Right, like by the time that alarm goes off on the surface of your skin and you see the spots, the virus has already been burning through your internal systems, your immune system, your lymphatic tissues, your bloodstream for well over a week. The skin showing a spot is just the final visible flare of an invasion that has already peaked.
That analogy is spot on. The rash is actually an immune response.
So it's not the virus directly causing the skin to turn red?
No, it's your immune cells finally recognizing the virus-infected cells in the small blood vessels of the skin and attacking them. The resulting inflammation is what you see as a rash.
That makes so much sense.
But before that smoke alarm goes off, you experience the prodrome phase.
The prodrome phase, what does that look like clinically?
So this is the period of early symptoms, those 4 days where you are highly contagious, but you don't have the rash yet. You get a rising fever, general malaise, and what clinicians refer to as the 3 Cs.
Which are?
cough, coryza, and conjunctivitis.
Okay, I know cough, obviously. Conjunctivitis is red, watery eyes, like pink eye. What is coryza?
Coryza is essentially a severe inflammation of the mucous membranes in the nose.
So just a really bad runny nose.
A very heavy, profoundly runny nose, yeah. So if a patient presents with a fever, and those 3 C's, a clinician might start getting suspicious. But there is one more early warning sign that appears during this prodrome phase, just before the rash breaks out.
The Koplik spots. I read about these in the historical data from our sources. They seem like the ultimate telltale sign.
They are what we call a pathognomonic sign.
Okay, translation please. What does pathognomonic mean?
It means a symptom that is so uniquely characteristic of a specific disease that if you see it, the diagnosis is beyond doubt.
Oh, wow. So there's no mistaking it for anything else.
Right. Koplik spots are these tiny white or bluish-white lesions that appear inside the cheeks on the mucous membranes of the mouth.
Like inside the mouth.
Yes. They're often described as looking like tiny grains of white sand on a red background. If a doctor looks inside a child's mouth and sees Koplik spots, along with the 3 C's, they know immediately it is measles.
And then the rash comes.
A couple of days later, the classic maculopapular rash begins.
And a maculopapular rash just means it has both flat red areas, maculas, and small raised bumps, papules, right?
Yes, exactly. It typically starts on the face, right around the hairline and the upper neck, and then over the next few days, it descends down the trunk, the arms, the legs, all the way to the feet.
And seeing that progression, I mean, it's easy to understand why the medical community was so focused on treating the acute illness. You want to get the fever down, keep the patient hydrated, and watch out for immediate severe complications like pneumonia or brain swelling.
Absolutely.
But this is the part of the research in our sources that honestly made me stop in my tracks. Because if the virus specifically targets and hijacks the immune cells, those CD150 receptors we talked about, that leads us to the most shocking modern scientific discovery about measles.
The long-term effects.
Right. We really need to spend some time talking about what happens to the body after the rash fades, because it is not over.
It is far from over. No. And this is a relatively recent, really profound paradigm shift in virology and immunology. We're talking about a phenomenon called immune amnesia.
Immune amnesia?
Yes. For a very long time, the clinical consensus was that once you beat the acute respiratory illness and the rash cleared up without severe immediate complications, you were fully recovered. You were in the clear.
Right, you got over it, you're fine.
But we now know the virus leaves a hidden devastation in its wake. It fundamentally damages the immune system's long-term memory.
Okay, immune amnesia. I need to understand what that actually means on a cellular level. Does it just make the immune system sluggish for a little while, like when you're recovering from the flu and you just feel run down?
No, it is far more destructive than just general fatigue. Independent studies published in the journals Science and Science Immunology around 2015 and 2019 mapped out the exact mechanism.
Okay, what did they find?
Remember we discussed how measles targets immune cells?
Yeah, the CD150 receptors.
Well, it specifically infects memory B cells.
And what is the specific job of a memory B cell?
Memory B cells are essentially the archivists of your immune system. They remember previous pathogens you've encountered and beaten in your lifetime.
So they keep a record.
Exactly. If you catch RSV when you're 2 years old, your body fights it off and then creates specific memory B cells that stick around. If you are exposed to RSV again when you're 4, those B cells instantly recognize it and produce antibodies to neutralize it before you get sick.
Okay, so they're the reason we don't get the exact same bug twice.
Right. And the studies found that a measles infection actively seeks out and destroys these memory B cells.
It destroys them.
Yes. It can eliminate anywhere from 11% to 73% of an individual's pre-existing antibody repertoire.
That is unbelievable. So I want to try to visualize this for the listener. Imagine your immune system is a highly curated playlist of every single fight you've ever survived, every cold, every stomach bug, every scrape.
Good analogy.
I always thought that getting a new illness just added a track to that playlist, but measles doesn't just add a nasty new track. It actually walks into the server room, smashes the hard drives, and deletes up to 3/4 of the songs you've spent your whole life collecting.
That is a very accurate way to visualize it. It literally deletes the biological archives. The plasma cells that are currently pumping out antibodies might survive, but the deep storage, the memory is wiped out.
Wow.
So the implications of this are staggering. Even if a child fully recovers from the acute phase of measles, looks perfectly healthy and goes back to school, they are left biologically vulnerable to other pathogens they had previously beaten.
Because the memory is gone.
Right. The body literally forgets how to fight off other illnesses for months, sometimes up to 2 or 3 years, after the measles infection. They have to rebuild their immune repertoire from scratch.
Which totally shifts how we have to look at historical death rates. Because when you read the history books, you see all these kids dying in the months following a measles outbreak, but they weren't necessarily dying from the measles virus itself.
Precisely. This recontextualizes historical mortality in a major way. When epidemiologists look back at data from before the vaccine, they see massive waves of childhood mortality from secondary bacterial infections.
Like what kind of infection?
Things like bacterial pneumonia, severe diarrheal diseases, or even simple ear infections that turned into deadly meningitis. For decades, those were just categorized as separate tragedies. A child had measles, got better, and then tragically died of pneumonia 6 months later.
But it was connected.
Exactly. With this modern understanding of immune amnesia, we can see that measles was the invisible architect of those deaths. It came in, wiped out the immune system's memory, and left the door wide open for other pathogens to do the lethal work.
It's like someone breaking into your house, disabling the security system, disarming the alarms, and then just walking out the back door, leaving it wide open for the next intruder to wander in.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And because of the biological toll of this virus, both the visible, immediate complications and the unseen, lingering toll of immune amnesia was so staggeringly high, humanity has spent centuries locked in a desperate arms race with it.
Let's trace that historical arms race, because I was surprised to learn just how long this virus has been stalking us. If it deletes our immune memory and causes so much collateral damage, how did early humans even survive it? The sources suggest its origins go way back, diverging from a cattle disease called rinderpest.
Yes.
What is rinderpest?
Rinderpest was an incredibly lethal infectious disease of cattle, domestic buffalo, and some other species of even-toed ungulates. It was actually the second infectious disease to be globally eradicated by mankind after smallpox.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was a massive achievement. But evolutionary genomic research points to the measles virus diverging from the rinderpest virus somewhere between the 6th century BCE and the 11th century CE.
So a long time ago.
A very long time ago. And the timing of this divergence makes perfect sense sociologically.
How so? Does it have to do with farming?
Farming, what more specifically population density. For a virus this infectious to survive, it requires a constant, uninterrupted supply of new susceptible hosts. Small nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers wouldn't sustain it.
Because it would just burn through everyone too fast.
Exactly. If measles entered a tribe of 50 people, it would infect everyone rapidly, the immune system would clear it from the survivors, and the virus would simply burn out and go extinct for lack of new hosts.
Right.
So it required the rise of large human settlements, the first real cities, with populations of at least 250,000 people, to maintain continuous human-to-human transmission. The virus evolved alongside human urbanization.
So it's basically a disease of civilization.
You could say that, yeah.
But reading the historical timelines, it seems like doctors didn't really single it out as a unique threat until much later, because back in antiquity, a fever and a rash could be 100 different things.
Right. For centuries, devastating diseases like smallpox, measles, and scarlet fever were often lumped together under generic terms for pestilence or plague. It wasn't really clear what was what.
So when did they figure it out?
It wasn't until the 9th or 10th century that we get a clear clinical distinction. It was the brilliant Persian physician Rhazes, also known as Al-Razi, who wrote one of the first and clearest written clinical accounts differentiating measles from smallpox.
And what did he say about it?
Well, what's notable is that he actually described measles as being more dreaded than smallpox in certain respects, particularly regarding its effect on children, which gives you an idea of the terror it instilled even then.
Let's fast forward a bit to the modern era, right before the vaccine was invented. Because I think people today living in a post-vaccine world genuinely do not comprehend the scale of the suffering.
No, they really don't.
Let's look at the data from the United States in the 1950s, before the vaccine was licensed in 1963. The CDC estimates there were 3 to 4 million people infected annually. 3 to 4 million. Every single year.
It was a ubiquitous part of childhood. Almost every child contracted it before the age of 15.
But we must look past the sheer number of infections and look at the burden. Out of those 3 to 4 million infections, the strain on the healthcare system was immense. We are talking about 48,000 hospitalizations annually in the U.S.
Just massive numbers.
Right, and 1,000 cases of acute encephalitis, which is dangerous brain swelling that often led to chronic, permanent neurological disability or deafness, and 400 to 500 deaths each year in the U.S. alone.
And that's just the U.S.
Right. Globally, the numbers were catastrophic. Before widespread vaccination, an estimated 2.6 million people died from measles globally every single year.
2.6 million deaths a year. It's almost unfathomable.
I keep going back to how we talk about this today because you hear people of a certain generation, maybe people who grew up in the 50s or early 60s, talk about measles with this weird, almost fond nostalgia.
Oh, definitely. We all had it.
Yeah, they call it a harmless rite of passage. You know the stories. Oh, everyone got it. You stayed home from school. Your mom pulled the shades down so the light wouldn't hurt your eyes. You watched cartoons. You got better.
Right.
But looking at these numbers, I have to challenge that cultural memory. Common is not the same thing as harmless. It seems to me that it was just normalized suffering. We just accepted that 500,000 kids would die every year in America and thousands more would be permanently disabled because before 1963, we simply didn't have a choice.
It's a classic psychological defense mechanism. We normalize what we cannot prevent. If a threat is ubiquitous and unavoidable, society builds a narrative around it being a rite of passage just to cope with the anxiety.
Because what else can you do?
Exactly. But the moment prevention became possible, the true horror of the disease became apparent in retrospect. No one today would willingly subject their child to a 1 in 1,000 risk of brain inflammation.
Right.
And that prevention arrived through a monumental, really thrilling scientific breakthrough in the mid-1950s.
Tell me about that breakthrough, because the story of John Enders and Thomas Peoples isolating the virus is fascinating. Enders was already famous by then, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. John Enders had already shared a Nobel Prize for his work in culturing the polio virus, which paved the way for the polio vaccine.
So he was a big deal.
Very big deal. In 1954, an outbreak of measles hit a boarding school called the Fay School in Massachusetts. Enders sent a younger researcher on his team, Thomas Peoples, out to the school to try to collect blood samples from infected students.
So Peebles is just driving out to this boarding school in the middle of an outbreak, taking blood from sick kids, trying to capture this biological ghost in a vial.
Exactly. And it was incredibly difficult work. They needed to isolate the virus in a lab setting, keep it alive, and get it to replicate in a tissue culture, which was a very new technique at the time.
Did he get it?
He did. Peoples managed to isolate the virus from the blood of a 13-year-old boy named David Edmonston.
David Edmonston. It's wild that we know the name of the middle schooler whose blood basically changed the course of human history.
It is a profound legacy, really. The virus they isolated became known as the Edmonston strain.
Okay.
And over the next decade, Enders and his colleagues worked tirelessly to weaken this virus. They passed it through different tissue cultures, human kidney cells, then human amnion cells, then chick embryo cells.
So they're basically making it adapt to non-human environments.
Exactly. Each time the virus adapted to a new environment, it became less and less adapted to causing human disease. It became attenuated. By 1963, they had developed the first licensed, live, attenuated measles vaccine.
And then they improved it a few years later, right?
Yes, in 1968, an improved, further weakened version called the MOAT strain, which stands for more attenuated Enders, was introduced. Remarkably, that MOAT strain is the exact same strain still used in the United States today.
Wow, since 1968.
Yeah, and in 1971, the brilliant vaccinologist Maurice Hillman combined it into the MMR vaccine. Measles, mumps, and rubella, given in a single shot.
And the efficacy of this vaccine is almost unparalleled in modern medicine. The data from our sources shows that just one dose gives you about 93% protection. If you get the recommended 2 doses, it bumps up to 97% effectiveness.
It's incredible.
But I have to ask a virology question here.
Yeah.
Because we've all lived through the COVID-19 pandemic, and we know that viruses mutate. We get updated flu shots every year because the flu virus changes its disguise.
Right.
Why doesn't the measles virus do that? Why is a vaccine developed from a kid's blood in 1954 still 97% effective today?
That is one of the most fortunate biological quirks for humanity.
Really? How so?
Well, viruses like influenza or SARS-CoV-2 undergo what we call antigenic drift. They constantly accumulate mutations in their surface proteins, changing their shape so that our immune system's antibodies no longer recognize them.
They put on a new mask?
Right. But measles has a massive virological constraint. Remember those H and F proteins, the grappling hook and the battering ram?
And the break-in tools.
The structure of those specific proteins is incredibly rigid. If the measles virus mutates those proteins too much in an attempt to escape the vaccine, the proteins lose their function. The grappling hook can no longer grab the CD150 receptor.
Ooh.
So any mutated measles virus essentially renders itself non-infectious. Because of this structural constraint, measles only has one main antigenic type.
So it's like the virus is wearing a very specific uniform, and if it tries to change its disguise to sneak past the guards, it loses its weapons and can't break into the building anymore.
Exactly. It is stuck with its original disguise.
Uh,
So the vaccine acts as a perfect fire drill for your immune system. We inject a weakened, pretend spark the live, attenuated virus. Your immune system learns exactly what that one unchanging uniform looks like, memorizes the profile, and builds the defenses.
and it never forgets.
Right. When the real wild virus shows up decades later, your immune system instantly recognizes it and shuts it down before it can even start the prodrome phase.
Okay, so we have a virus that refuses to change its disguise, and we possess a medical tool that is 97% effective and incredibly safe.
Yes.
Which leads me to a massive point of confusion. Looking at the global data from the sources, if we have the perfect weapon, why did global measles cases hit 10.3 million in 2023? Why did the Americas lose their regional elimination status in 2025? Why are we moving backward?
Because the battle against measles is no longer a purely biological or virological problem. It is a sociological problem.
Sociology over biology.
The virus hasn't changed its tactics. Human behavior and social infrastructure have shifted. Measles is now a sociological formula.
I want to dig deep into this sociological formula, because to understand how it exploits our social networks, we have to look at the sheer math of how contagious it is. I'm looking at this metric in the data called R0, or the basic reproduction number.
Right.
Can you explain how R0 works in plain English?
R0 is an epidemiological metric that measures the transmissibility of an infectious agent. It essentially asks, if you drop one infected person into a completely susceptible population, meaning no one is vaccinated and no one has had the disease before, how many other people will that one person directly infect?
Give me some context. What are the numbers for diseases we're more familiar with?
For context, the R0 of seasonal influenza is usually around 1.3 to 2. One person infects maybe two others.
Okay.
The R0 of the original SARS-CoV-2 strain back in 2020 was roughly 2 to 3.
So relatively low compared to what we're talking about today.
Oh, absolutely. The R0 of measles, it is estimated to be between 12 and 18.
12 to 18 people infected from just one single case. That is mind-boggling.
It is widely considered one of the most infectious pathogenic agents ever identified by human science. And because the R0 is so extraordinarily high, the threshold required to stop it from spreading through a community is incredibly demanding.
You're talking about herd immunity.
Yes. Herd immunity or community immunity. The formula for herd immunity is directly tied to the R0. To build a wall of immunity high enough to stop measles from finding a susceptible host, a community generally needs about 95% of its population to have two-dose vaccine coverage.
95%. That leaves almost zero room for error.
Exactly. If you maintain 95%, the virus hits dead ends and dies out. But if you drop to 94%, 90%, 85%, the virus will inevitably find the gaps.
And where are we globally right now?
Right now, the global numbers are flashing red. In 2024, global first dose coverage was only 84%. Second dose coverage was just 76%.
So we are leaving millions of children around the world completely unprotected.
We are.
And when those immunity gaps open up, the historical case studies of what happens next are just devastating. I was reading through the historical timelines provided in the sources, and the 1875 outbreak in Fiji really stood out to me.
Oh, yeah.
It is a chilling example of what happens when a highly contagious virus meets a completely susceptible population. But it was driven by human movement, right?
The 1875 Fiji epidemic is one of the darkest events in epidemiological history, and it is a perfect example of sociology driving biology. It was a collision of extreme biological susceptibility and colonial politics.
What exactly happened?
In late 1874, the Fijian paramount chief, King Siru Ebenezer traveled to Sydney, Australia, with a large delegation to finalize the British annexation of Fiji. While in Sydney, several members of the delegation were exposed to measles.
And because it was a completely isolated island population, none of them had any historical immunity. They were totally susceptible.
Exactly. On their journey back to Fiji aboard the HMS Dido, the king and his sons fell ill. Now, under normal public health protocols, the ship should have been heavily quarantined upon arrival.
But I'm guessing it wasn't.
No. Due to a catastrophic failure of colonial administration and perhaps a reluctance to confine royalty, the quarantine protocols were bypassed. They disembarked.
Oh, no.
And then, a massive meeting of chiefs from all over the Fijian Islands was held at Navuso to discuss the new colonial government.
A massive gathering. It's the worst possible scenario for a virus with an R naught of 18.
It was a super-spreading environment. The chiefs contracted the virus and then returned to their home villages across the archipelago. The virus swept through the islands with terrifying speed.
And people just couldn't fight it off.
Right. And what killed people wasn't just the virus itself, it was the total collapse of the social fabric. When 90% of a village falls sick simultaneously, there is no one left to fetch water, tend to the fires, or gather food. People were dying of dehydration and starvation alongside the acute disease.
That is horrifying.
Estimates vary, but historical accounts suggest anywhere from 1/5 to 1/3 of the entire indigenous Fijian population died in a matter of months.
A third of a population. That is an apocalyptic level of devastation. And it's easy for us sitting here to look back at 1875 and think, well, that was the 19th century. They were isolated. We didn't have modern medicine or vaccines. But the horrifying truth is that we see modern examples of this exact same devastation. We look at outbreaks in Madagascar and the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2018 and 2019.
Yes. In Madagascar, between 2018 and 2019, an outbreak exploded, resulting in over 240,000 cases and more than 1,000 deaths, overwhelmingly among children.
And the DRC.
In the DRC, around the same time, the outbreak was even larger, and the death toll surpassed 6,000.
And in those modern contexts, it wasn't a lack of a vaccine existing in the world. It was a failure of logistics and infrastructure.
Exactly. In places like the DRC or Madagascar, the immunity gaps are driven by systemic poverty, political conflict, and incredibly fragile healthcare infrastructure. When you combine chronically low vaccination rates with high levels of child malnutrition, specifically vitamin A deficiency, which is crucial for immune function and eye health, and poor access to supportive hospital care, measles reverts to being a mass killer. The virus exploits the cracks in the geopolitical system.
But it's not just a lack of resources in developing nations that creates these gaps. Sometimes the gaps are created in highly resourced, wealthy countries by collapse in social trust.
Absolutely.
Which leads us to a crucial part of the modern history of this disease. We have to talk about the misinformation engine, and specifically the 1998 Wakefield paper.
We must. It is impossible to discuss the sociology of modern measles outbreaks without addressing it. In 1998, Andrew Wakefield and a group of colleagues published a paper in The Lancet, a highly respected medical journal, claiming a potential link between the MMR vaccine and autism spectrum disorder in children.
And I want to be crystal clear right here, right now, as every single source in front of us explicitly lays out. That paper was entirely retracted by The Lancet in 2010. Extensive investigative reporting by Brian Deere and the BMJ described the work as outright fraudulent, detailing how data was altered and falsified. And beyond that, extensive global expert reviews involving millions of children across multiple countries, including massive reviews by the WHO as recently as 2025, have repeatedly and definitively reaffirmed that there is absolutely zero causal link between vaccines and autism.
Yes. Scientifically, the claim collapsed completely upon rigorous review. The data simply did not support the conclusion. But culturally, sociologically, the ghost of that paper continues to haunt global public health.
Because the damage was already done.
Right. The media amplified the initial claims long before the scientific community could thoroughly debunk them. It provided a mythic origin story for modern anti-vaccine movements. It damaged trust deeply, and it helped create localized, persistent immunity gaps in numerous high-income countries in Europe and North America.
And I think it's really important that we approach the topic of vaccine hesitancy carefully and impartially here, because when you look at the sociological data, distrust in the medical establishment doesn't just spontaneously generate out of nowhere. It stems from incredibly complex sources.
It really does.
For some groups, it's rooted in political polarization, where health choices somehow become coded to partisan identity. For others, it's rooted in very real, painful histories of medical neglect or systemic racism.
Yes.
And sometimes it's just basic access barriers. A parent might want to vaccinate their child, but they can't get time off work, they don't have paid sick leave, or the nearest clinic is an hour away by bus. We aren't here to take political sides or judge the parents. We just have to recognize the biological reality. The virus doesn't care why a child isn't vaccinated. It has no politics. It just exploits the loophole.
That is the crux of the sociological formula.
Mm-hmm.
An infectious person plus shared indoor air, plus a susceptible host. Measles exploits local pockets. A country might boast a national average of 92% vaccination coverage.
Yeah.
That sounds great on paper. But national averages mean absolutely nothing. If a specific elementary school, a specific neighborhood, or a closely knit religious community is sitting at 60% coverage, the virus will skip over the vaccinated majority, find that 60% pocket, and ignite a massive local outbreak.
I have a question about how it ignites in those pockets. Because during the COVID pandemic, we talked a lot about the concept of super spreaders. The idea that maybe due to biological quirks, certain specific individuals had a uniquely high viral load or shed way more virus than a normal person, infecting dozens of people at once. Is that how measles works? Do we need a biological measles super spreader to start a major outbreak?
It's a great question, but the metaphor needs a slight adjustment for measles. What's fascinating here is that unlike other diseases, measles doesn't require a unique biological superspreader individual.
Really?
Yeah, the biology of the virus is already dialed up to maximum evolutionary efficiency for transmission. It sheds massively in everyone who has it.
Everyone is a super spreader.
Essentially, yes. Therefore, all it takes is an ordinary, average infection. If that ordinary infection wanders into the wrong social network, a crowded waiting room, a community with low vaccination rates, a densely packed theme park, the environment turns it into a super-spreading event. The vulnerability of the crowd creates the super-spreader dynamic, not the biology of the individual.
That makes total sense. And perhaps the most tragic modern example of how all these sociological factors, trust, infrastructure, and misinformation can fatally collide is the outbreak in Samoa in 2019. Can you walk me through exactly what happened there? Because the timeline and the sources is just heartbreaking.
The Samoa outbreak is a profound and heartbreaking masterclass in how fragile public health truly is and how quickly it can collapse. The crisis actually began a year earlier, in 2018, with a horrific medical error.
Okay, what happened?
Two nurses at a clinic in Samoa were preparing the MMR vaccine for two infants. The vaccine comes as a powder that must be reconstituted with sterile water. Tragically, the nurses mistakenly mixed the vaccine powder with an expired liquid muscle relaxant instead of water.
Oh my God. A muscle relaxant. So the infants were injected with a paralytic.
Yes. Both infants stopped breathing shortly after the injection and died. It was a catastrophic operational error, entirely human error, and had absolutely nothing to do with the safety of the vaccine itself. But the damage to public trust was immediate and seismic.
I mean, naturally.
The government suspended the national vaccination program for several months to investigate.
If I try to put myself in the shoes of a parent in that community, if you hear that two babies died immediately after getting a routine shot at the local clinic, of course you're going to be terrified. The nuance of it was a mixing error gets lost in the sheer panic.
Exactly. It is a completely understandable human reaction to be afraid. But that understandable fear was then heavily, aggressively amplified by anti-vaccine misinformation campaigns.
Ah, here we go.
Activists from outside the country flooded social media in Samoa, exploiting the tragedy to spread broader fears about vaccines. As a result, even after the government resumed the program and assured the public it was safe, parents stayed away.
The trust was gone.
Completely. Routine measles vaccination coverage in Samoa plummeted from around 58% down to just 31%. They essentially dropped their shield.
And then in 2019, the virus arrived from a traveler.
It did. The virus was imported into this now highly susceptible, unvaccinated population. The resulting outbreak was explosive. In a country of roughly 200,000 people, there were over 5,700 confirmed cases.
Wow.
And tragically, the outbreak killed at least 83 people, the vast majority of them babies and young children under the age of 4. The hospitals were overwhelmed. It serves as a grim reminder that trust is a vital, load-bearing piece of public health infrastructure. When trust breaks down, the immunity gap widens, and the virus steps right in.
Which brings up the human element behind all these statistics. These localized outbreaks, whether we are talking about Samoa or an under-vaccinated school district in Ohio or a theme park in California, force us to look at the people who suffer when the shield drops. Because we aren't just protecting ourselves. Who are the people fundamentally at risk in these pockets?
When we talk about the ethics of epidemiology, we must consider the inherently vulnerable groups within our society who cannot rely on their own immune systems. First and foremost, you have infants under 12 months old.
Because they can't get the shot yet.
Exactly. The first dose of the MMR vaccine isn't typically given until a child is 12 to 15 months old, because maternal antibodies can interfere with the live vaccine before that age. So for the first year of their life, babies are completely 100% reliant on the people around them not carrying the virus.
Then you have pregnant people who face an increased risk of severe complications, premature labor, or low birth weight if infected.
You also have the severely immunocompromised. We're talking about children undergoing chemotherapy for leukemia, people with advanced HIV, or patients who are on immunosuppressive drugs because they have received organ transplants. For these individuals, even if they were fully vaccinated in the past, their immune systems may no longer be able to mount a defense. The memory B cells may be gone or suppressed. And finally, you have vaccine non-responders. The estimated 3% of people for whom the vaccine simply didn't confer robust immunity due to individual biological variations.
So, ethically speaking, how do we navigate this? Because in many Western societies, we place a massive foundational value on personal freedom and bodily autonomy, and rightly so. But airborne viruses clearly do not respect personal boundaries.
It is the central tension of public health. The decision to remain unvaccinated is almost always experienced by the individual as a purely personal choice. The thought process is, I am choosing what to do with my own body, and I accept the risk for myself or my child.
Right.
But biologically, epidemiologically, and ethically, that choice functions as an environmental risk to every single person who breathes the same air.
We can look at this through a few different ethical lenses, right? If you look at it through deontology, which is the ethical framework focused on duties and rules, you could argue we have a fundamental moral duty to our fellow citizens not to expose them to preventable, potentially lethal harm.
Definitely.
Or if you look through the lens of utilitarianism, the goal is to maximize well-being and reduce total harm across the population, which clearly dictates maintaining high vaccination coverage to prevent mass suffering and hospitalizations.
Both are valid frameworks. But perhaps the most resonant ethical lens for infectious disease is care ethics. Care ethics shifts the focus away from abstract rules or stark calculations and instead emphasizes our relationships, our mutual dependencies, and our inherent responsibility to protect the vulnerable members of our community who literally cannot protect themselves. It asks, what do we owe to each other?
I really like that framing. I've been thinking about this idea of shared air. It's like, well, public health is essentially a massive society-wide group project.
A group project, yeah.
And in every group project, there are always some people who can't do the heavy lifting. In this case, the quiet kids in the group project are the infants, the chemotherapy patients, the transplant recipients. They physically cannot fight off the virus. You can't just abandon them to fail the class. Getting vaccinated isn't just about putting on a personal suit of armor. It is active participation in an invisible safety net. When you get the MMR shot, you are holding up your corner of the net for the 6-month-old baby in the waiting room who can't.
That is a deeply empathetic way to conceptualize it. The ethical challenge of the 21st century is recognizing that our individual actions ripple outward through the air we share. A classroom is a shared biological commons. A grocery store is a shared biological commons. And to protect that invisible safety net in an increasingly connected, globalized world where a virus can cross an ocean in 12 hours, public health is constantly looking toward the future.
Let's pivot to that future. Because despite the grim outbreaks, the overarching goal of global health organizations is incredibly ambitious. They talk about control, elimination, and eradication. Control is just keeping the numbers manageable.
Right.
Elimination is stopping continuous transmission in a specific region like the U.S. achieved in 2000, even though travelers still bring imported cases that spark small fires. But eradication. Eradication means wiping the virus off the face of the earth permanently so it no longer exists outside of a few secure labs, like we did with smallpox in 1980. Is it actually possible to eradicate measles?
Biologically speaking, yes. Measles is entirely eradicable. It meets all the virological criteria.
Which are?
First, it has no animal reservoir. It doesn't hide in bat populations or wild birds where it can mutate and jump back to humans.
Okay, that's huge.
Second, there are no asymptomatic chronic carriers. If you have it, you eventually clear it or die, but you don't harbor it for life. And third, we have a phenomenal stable vaccine. If we can reach the entire human population, we can end it.
So the biology is on our side. It's just the logistics that are the nightmare.
Exactly. Logistically, it is a monumental task. It requires unprecedented global coordination, sustained funding, and the ability to safely deliver vaccines into active conflict zones, remote terrains, and areas suffering from political instability.
But looking at the sources, technology is offering some incredible new countermeasures to help bridge those massive logistical gaps. One of the most promising things I read about is the development of microneedle vaccine patches. Can you explain how these work physically? Because it sounds like science fiction.
They are a major logistical leap forward. One of the hardest parts of global vaccination campaigns is maintaining what we call the cold chain.
The cold chain.
Yes. A liquid vaccine must be kept perfectly refrigerated from the moment it leaves the manufacturing plant onto the cargo planes, into the transport trucks, all the way to a remote village clinic. If the refrigeration fails, the vaccine degrades and becomes useless. Plus, you need highly trained medical staff with sterile syringes to administer it safely, which creates medical waste.
Right, which is incredibly difficult if a country doesn't have reliable electricity or road infrastructure.
Exactly. Microneedle patches bypass many of these hurdles. They are small, bandage-like patches about the size of a coin. The surface is embedded with microscopic, dissolvable cones, the microneedles that contain the dried, stabilized vaccine.
So no liquid.
No liquid. You simply press the patch onto the skin, like applying a Band-Aid. The microneedles painlessly penetrate the very top layer of the skin, dissolve within minutes, and release the vaccine directly to the immune cells located in the skin layer.
That is genius. Does it actually work in the real world?
It does.
Uh-huh.
There was a highly successful Phase 1 and 2 trial conducted in the Gambia in 2024. The trial showed that these patches were safe, well-tolerated, and highly immunogenic in adults, toddlers, and importantly, infants.
Because they're temperature stable.
Exactly. Because they are much more temperature stable than liquid vaccines and can be applied with minimal training, potentially even by parents themselves, it could completely revolutionize vaccine delivery in low-resource settings.
That gives me a lot of hope. And beyond just delivery, we're also getting way better at detecting the virus before the clinics even fill up with sick kids. I was fascinated by the section on wastewater monitoring. We heard a lot about this during the COVID pandemic, but they're applying it to measles now, right?
Yes, environmental surveillance is becoming a crucial early warning system. When a person is infected with measles, they shed viral RNA in their bodily waste. By routinely sampling the sewage at municipal wastewater treatment plants, scientists can detect the genetic signature of the virus circulating in a community.
And it gives them a head start. There was a specific example from the source's Colorado, I believe.
Yes, in August 2025, in Mesa County, Colorado, public health officials detected the measles virus in the local wastewater system. Crucially, they detected it before a single clinical case had been diagnosed by a doctor.
Before anyone even went to the doctor.
Exactly. That kind of lead time is invaluable. It gives public health agencies days, sometimes weeks, to alert local pediatricians to be on the lookout for the 3 C's in complex spots and to immediately prep targeted vaccination campaigns to shore up the local immunity walls before the outbreak spirals out of control.
And of course, because we are living in the late 2020s, we have to talk about the role of artificial intelligence. AI is stepping into disease surveillance and outbreak detection in a really big way. How exactly does an AI model help track a virus?
The primary promise of AI in epidemiology is unparalleled speed and pattern recognition. AI models can be trained on vast troves of historical, epidemiological data to understand what an outbreak looks like in its earliest stages.
Okay.
Once trained, these systems can continuously scan massive databases of electronic health records across a region in real time.
So it's looking for anomalies.
Exactly. An AI can look for tiny, dispersed signals that a human might miss. It can scan emergency room logs for a sudden uptick in that specific cluster of symptoms, the fever, plus the cough, coryza, and conjunctivitis. It can integrate data from school districts, tracking sudden spikes in elementary school absenteeism. It can synthesize all this data and flag a potential hotspot days before a human epidemiologist might notice the trend.
But the sources raise a massive red flag regarding AI. The peril of AI in public health is algorithmic bias. I want to make sure I understand how this bias actually works in practice. Because an algorithm doesn't have personal prejudice, but it can still make harmful decisions. How does that happen?
It happens because AI systems are only as good and as complete as the data they are trained on. Let's say you train an outbreak detection AI using historical health records strictly from wealthy, highly resourced hospital systems.
Okay.
The AI learns what normal disease spread looks like in a population that has easy access to doctors, digital health portals, and regular checkups.
Right, makes sense.
But then, you deploy that same AI model to monitor a marginalized community, perhaps a rural area, or an underfunded urban neighborhood that lacks consistent healthcare access. In these communities, people might not go to the doctor for early symptoms because they can't afford the copay, or the clinic still uses paper records that the AI can't read.
So the data is missing.
Exactly. If the community doesn't have a reliable, standardized digital footprint, the AI might completely misread the situation. It might see silence and assume there is no outbreak, delaying vital resources.
Or it could go the other way, right? If vaccination records in a specific community are incomplete due to historical systemic neglect, the AI might constantly flag that neighborhood as high risk, leading to increased scrutiny that feels punitive and stigmatizing to the residents rather than supportive.
Exactly. The algorithm codifies historical disparities.
I think this is where we have to be really careful about tech utopian visions in public health. AI is a powerful tool, but it is not a savior. Sure, an AI system can analyze cellular data to map a transmission hotspot in 5 seconds. It can instantaneously draft a perfectly translated multilingual exposure notice to send to everyone's phones.
But it has limits.
Right. An AI cannot sit down in a clinic room with a terrified parent whose community has been historically abused or ignored by the medical system, look them in the eye, listen to their fears without judgment, and earn their trust. The speed of technology is incredible, but it cannot ever replace the human foundation of public health.
Building trust requires a human being.
That is a profound point.
Huh.
AI can spot the smoke, but human beings have to carry the water. Public health fundamentally relies on human relationships, community leaders, pediatricians, school nurses, and local advocates to bridge the gap between stark scientific reality and complex human behavior. Which brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's summarize what we've uncovered. Measles is not and never was a harmless childhood rite of passage. It is a masterclass in contagion. It's a biological thief that literally steals your immune system's memory, leaving you exposed to the ghosts of infections past.
Yes.
And socially, it is an opportunist. It is a virus that preys on our divides. It exploits our infrastructure gaps, our logistical failures, our misinformation networks, and perhaps most dangerously, our fading cultural memory of just how severe it used to be.
It exploits every single weakness we give it, whether biological or social.
So, to you, listening to this right now, the next time you walk into a crowded waiting room, an airport terminal, a classroom, or a grocery store, I want you to remember that the air you breathe is a shared biological commons. It is an invisible web connecting your lungs to everyone else in that room. And that web is only protected by the invisible, quiet choices of the people around you. The choice to vaccinate is the choice to protect the quiet kids in the group project.
And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over. It's a paradox, really.
What's that?
Because the measles vaccine is so incredibly miraculously effective, we have successfully raised an entire generation of doctors, parents, and policymakers who have never had to see the horrors of the disease firsthand. They've never walked through pediatric wards full of children suffering from encephalitis. And so the question we face is this. If human memory fades faster than biological risk, how do we maintain the societal motivation to fight a monster when our own monumental success is exactly what made that monster invisible?
How do we remember to fear the empty room? Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.